There is an experiment that changed everything we thought we knew about wealth and poverty. In 2013, researchers Senthil Mullainathan and Eldar Shafir conducted a study with sugarcane farmers in Tamil Nadu, India. These farmers receive their entire annual income in one lump sum after the harvest. This means the same person is poor before harvest and relatively comfortable after harvest. Same person, same intelligence, same work ethic. Same work ethic, same work ethic. The only thing that changed was their financial state. The researchers gave them cognitive tests at both points. Before harvest, when they were financially stressed, the farmers scored significantly lower, the equivalent of 13 to 14 IQ points lower. That is the difference between average intelligence and borderline impairment. Not because they became less intelligent, because poverty was consuming their mental bandwidth. This finding should permanently end every conversation that begins with, "Poor people just need to make better decisions." They are making decisions with a brain that is being taxed by the very condition you are telling them to think their way out of. Today, we are going to explore what actually separates the rich from the poor, and it is not what the motivational speakers tell you. Mullainathan and Shafir published their landmark book, Scarcity: Why Having Too Little Means So Much in 2013, and it introduced a concept that should be taught in every economics classroom on Earth, the bandwidth tax. Here is how it works. Your brain has a finite amount of cognitive bandwidth, the mental resources available for thinking, planning, decision-making, and self-control. When you are financially secure, most of that bandwidth is free. You can think about your career, your children's education, your long-term goals. The mental background is quiet. When you are financially insecure, a massive portion of that bandwidth is consumed by the immediate problem. How will I make rent? Can I afford this grocery bill? What happens if my car breaks down? These are not passing thoughts. They are persistent, intrusive cognitive loads that occupy working memory the same way a demanding task occupies your attention during a test. They performed experiments showing that simply asking people to think about a hypothetical large unexpected expense impaired their cognitive performance, but only if they were low income. High-income participants were unaffected because the scenario did not trigger real threat. This is not a metaphor about distraction. This is measurable cognitive impairment caused by financial scarcity, and it creates a vicious cycle. Poverty impairs decision-making. Impaired decisions deepen poverty. The trap is not moral. It is mechanical. The takeaway is not for people in poverty. They already know the reality. The takeaway is for everyone else. The next time you judge someone's financial decisions, remember that you are evaluating choices made with a brain operating under conditions you have likely never experienced. Empathy is not just morally correct here, it is scientifically required. Ask a wealthy person what they are planning for, and they will talk about the next 5 years, 10 years, their children's future, retirement. Ask someone living paycheck to paycheck, and the horizon shrinks to this week, this month, maybe next month. This is not a character difference, it is a structural one. When your basic needs are uncertain, your brain shifts into what psychologists call a present-focused orientation. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for long-term planning and impulse control, is literally downregulated when the amygdala is activated by threat. Your brain reallocates resources from planning mode to survival mode, and survival mode does not care about your retirement account. A 2012 study by Anandi Mani and colleagues, published in Science, demonstrated that financial worries impose a cognitive load equivalent to losing an entire night of sleep. Imagine trying to make optimal long-term financial decisions while running on zero sleep. That is the daily cognitive state of millions of people. Wealthy people are not better at long-term thinking because they are wiser. They are better at long-term thinking because their brains have the luxury of thinking long-term. When your present is secure, your brain naturally extends its planning horizon. When your present is threatened, the future collapses to tomorrow. This quote is not poetic irony. It is economic fact. Payday loans, late fees, overdraft charges, inability to buy in bulk, lack of access to preventive health care. Poverty comes with a financial surcharge that compounds the psychological one. The poor pay more for worse outcomes, and their brains are too taxed to find the exits. In 1972, psychologist Walter Mischel conducted the famous Stanford marshmallow experiment. Children were offered 1 marshmallow now, or 2 marshmallows if they waited 15 minutes. The children who waited went on to have better SAT scores, lower BMI, and higher educational attainment. The conclusion seemed clear. Delayed gratification is the key to success. Discipline wins. For 40 years, this was gospel. Then, in 2018, Tyler Watts, Greg Duncan, and Hyeon Kwan replicated the study with a much larger and more diverse sample, over 900 children. Their findings complicated the original narrative dramatically. When they controlled for socioeconomic background, the predictive power of the marshmallow test largely disappeared. The children who waited were not more disciplined. They were more affluent. They came from homes where promises were kept, where there would be food tomorrow, where waiting was a rational strategy because the environment was reliable. The children who grabbed the marshmallow immediately were not impulsive. They were making a perfectly rational decision for their environment. In unstable homes, a promise of future reward is unreliable. Taking what you can get right now is not a failure of willpower. It is an adaptation to uncertainty. This reframing is critical. We have spent decades telling people that wealth is a product of self-control and poverty is a product of its absence. The reality is that self-control is a product of environmental stability. Give people a stable environment and delayed gratification emerges naturally. Destabilize the environment, and the most rational strategy is to take the marshmallow now. The takeaway, if you want to build your capacity for delayed gratification, do not practice willpower. Build stability, secure your basics, create an emergency fund. Reduce uncertainty. Your ability to think long-term is not a fixed trait. It is a response to how safe your present feels. You have probably heard these terms thrown around in self-help circles: scarcity mindset, abundance mindset. Usually, it is framed as a choice. Just think abundantly and abundance will follow. This is dangerously incomplete. Mullainathan and Shafir's research shows that scarcity mindset is not a choice. It is a cognitive state induced by actual scarcity. When resources are scarce, the brain enters a tunnel vision mode. It becomes exceptionally focused on the immediate scarce resource, money, food, time, and simultaneously loses peripheral awareness of everything else. This tunneling makes you very good at solving the immediate problem and very bad at seeing the bigger picture. This explains why someone in financial distress might take a payday loan at 400% interest. It is not that they do not understand the math. It is that their brain is tunneled on the immediate need. The electricity bill, the car repair, the medical expense, and the long-term cost is literally outside their cognitive field of view. The tunnel blocks it. Abundance mindset, by contrast, is not a motivational state. It is a cognitive state that emerges when basic needs are met and cognitive bandwidth is freed. People with financial security can see more options, weigh more factors, and consider more consequences, not because they are smarter, but because their brains are not under siege. A study by Jiang Zhao and colleagues at the University of British Columbia found that scarcity-induced tunneling caused people to neglect important tasks, borrow excessively from future resources, and make choices that worsened their long-term position, even when they knew better. Knowing the right answer does not help when your brain cannot allocate the resources to act on it. The takeaway, abundance mindset is real, but you cannot just think your way into it, you build it from the ground up. Secure your basic needs. Reduce the sources of chronic financial stress. Even small buffers, an emergency fund, insurance, a stable living situation, can shift your brain from tunnel mode to planning mode. The mindset follows the material conditions, not the other way around. Here is the part that makes people uncomfortable. The biggest predictor of where you end up financially is where you started. A landmark study by economist Raj Chetty and colleagues analyzed the earnings of millions of Americans and found that the single strongest predictor of a child's future income was their parents' income and the zip code they grew up in. Not their test scores, not their personality, their starting position. This does not mean individual effort is irrelevant. It means individual effort operates within a context that dramatically amplifies or suppresses it. A disciplined, intelligent person born into a stable middle-class family with access to good schools, healthcare, and social connections has a fundamentally different probability distribution of outcomes than an equally disciplined, equally intelligent person born into poverty in a neighborhood with failing schools, no healthcare, and high crime. The psychological consequence is that wealthy people often develop what psychologists call the fundamental attribution error, applied to their own success. They attribute their wealth to personal qualities, hard work, intelligence, discipline, while underweighting the environmental advantages that made those qualities productive. Meanwhile, they attribute poverty to personal failings while underweighting the environmental barriers that make escape nearly impossible. This is not about guilt. It is about accuracy. If you want to understand why some people are rich and others are poor, you have to look at the systems, not just the individuals within them. The brain under poverty is not a broken brain. It is a normal brain responding to abnormal conditions. The real difference between rich and poor is not discipline. It is not intelligence. It is not some mystical abundance mindset. It is bandwidth. It is the cognitive freedom to plan beyond tomorrow. It is the environmental stability that makes long-term thinking rational. It is the accumulated advantage of starting life with a buffer between you and catastrophe. And if that makes you uncomfortable, if you would rather believe that wealth is purely a product of personal virtue, consider this. The same sugarcane farmers who scored 13 IQ points lower before harvest scored 13 IQ points higher after harvest. Nothing about them changed, only their circumstances did. The most empowering thing you can learn about money is not a strategy or a mindset hack. It is the understanding that your financial behavior is shaped by your financial environment far more than by your character. Change the environment and the behavior follows. That is not a feel-good platitude. That is the science, and it applies to you just as much as it applies to everyone else.